Deconverted Man. Today, a look at Lenox, the smartest dumb guy that I'm aware of.
We have been faced with someone talking who is a distinguished skeptic. As I understand it, the word skeptine is a Greek word that means to check from a distance. And skepticism is very important, and Michael has demonstrated in many of his books the pseudosciences that we need to get out of our thinking. But ladies and gentlemen, we may start with a skeptical approach to Christianity. That would be wise, to check it all out from a distance. But there comes a point when you have to give up your distance. You see, if I had been skeptical about my wife all her life, she'd never have become my wife. I did check her out at a distance to start with. But then, in order to make that profound commitment that has now lasted 40 years, I gave up my distance and approached a person. And belief in God, ladies and gentlemen, is not belief in a theory, because you can keep approaching theories from a distance. Belief in God is in the end commitment to a person. And you can never know the reality of that kind of commitment unless you give up your skepticism, and on the basis of the evidence you've accumulated, you start to commit yourself to a person. You won't know everything, but I have tried to argue that there's enough basis in science, in history, in philosophy, in God's self-revelation to be at least a platform from which we can begin to give up our skepticism and enjoy a positive relationship with the God that created us to enjoy himself eternally. Thank you.
Argument to and from analogy. Not always logically invalid, but I think in this case it is. So I'm going to represent his soon-to-be wife with Trico. I don't know. Okay, so Trico. We can see Trico, we can touch it, we can smell it, we can taste it, and we know it's there, okay? And so John's saying, oh, I checked out my wife, who wasn't my wife yet, from a distance, and then I lost my skepticism at some point and formed a relationship. Aww. Okay, well, that's nice, but the thing is, there isn't any real skepticism going on here between him and his soon-to-be wife, nor is there any skepticism going on between me and Trico here. I know that Trico exists, and I can gather a lot of information from Trico's signals to me. Now, Trico isn't a living person or animal, so I'm going to have to pretend that Trico is here. And so the subconscious behaviors that Trico would have, dilation of eyes, producing of pheromones, and so on and so forth, all of this would affect my brain in ways that I can't recognize on a conscious level. And then, of course, the conscious behaviors. We talk to each other, we spend time with each other, and we go places together, we enjoy each other's company, we share our life stories, you know, we get along together, and eventually that becomes a romance, and, you know, there you go. Alright, the rest is history. I now have to marry Trico. Okay, that's where the analogy ends. Okay, anyways, but, so, God, alright, unlike Trico, here's God. Right there. You see it? No? It's there. It really is. You just can't see it, or feel it, or taste it, or touch it, or hear it. You can only feel it inside. And the interesting thing is about that, you can only feel it inside after engaging in certain religious activity. Sometimes people will feel God and then come to a particular religion. So either way can happen, but it's not God. At least there's no way to distinguish between God and a chemical reaction in your brain. So if we can produce this chemically, and we can, and if we can produce this in other ways, say meditation, we can produce a feeling like that, or going to a concert, or engaging in other activities, we can produce a similar, if not exact, or even more profound feeling. We wouldn't label those things God. So why do people label this feeling God? Well, because they don't have an explanation for it. So we assume agency when we don't have an explanation. That's just how our brains function. If we can't immediately understand something, it's caused by someone. So the door slowly creaks open. We get really scared and we think there's someone there, and we look and there's no one there. It must have been a ghost. Because we don't have any other explanation. We're surrounded by potential explanations already given by our society. Our society has already built up ideas that are spooky that we've heard about, but we never really gave any credit to until this spooky situation happens to us, and our brain can't think of any other explanation, so it just latches on to the explanation that we had, even if that explanation is ridiculous in nature. And to overcome that moment and to remain skeptical is difficult, but not impossible. John says, lose your skepticism. In other words, in that moment, forget about being skeptical. Just pretend it was the ghost. Just assume that it was God. Don't investigate further. And that's not scientific. There's a difference between a relationship with a person or trico and a relationship with something that is completely undetectable by any means at all. The difference is, we can test this, we can't test this. Big difference. If this really exists, and it might, but I see no reason to think it does, it's identical to nature. It's identical to things that can come about on their own without any external influence whatsoever. The chemicals that your brain produces in order to make you feel the sensation that some people call God or religious experience or spiritual experience are chemicals that you yourself can release in your own brain if you train yourself to do it. They're chemicals that we can inject into you and you can feel this way. What's interesting to note is that not everybody's brain is the same, so there will be some people who cannot experience this at all, which is what we would expect to see because of the diversity of biological evolution. How would a deity be able to explain that? Well, because they weren't chosen by that deity or whatever, or that deity is really testing them. Okay. I've met Christians when I was a Christian that said, I've never really felt God, but like they'll say something like, when I read certain passages, I see them in a different way or whatever. And I've met those who say, I've felt God very strongly, and I've met those who said, I've heard God. That's creepy, by the way. Even as a Christian, I was like, really? I've never heard God. I felt it, but I never heard it. Yeah, you're not trying hard enough. Okay. You know. So there's that will be edited out. There's a difference between Trico and God. There's a difference between his wife and God. A huge difference. And I know us skeptics recognize that difference, but I don't think that the religiously minded recognize that difference. John already has his conclusions made up. He already has his idea about what God is made up in his own brain. He already thinks that he's having a real relationship with something, with someone, rather than his own conscious and unconscious processes. He doesn't think that it could ever possibly be a feedback loop happening all in here. He thinks that it's something coming in and affecting him. But if that was the case, then something at some point has to be measurable in that process. There would be some machine that we could construct that would see that it's not originating in here. We would see that it's coming from out here somewhere in the rest of the world, we would see that. There would be some way to detect that. And what we do see when we look at people's brains while they're engaged in religious activity, while we have the scanner thing on their head and we're measuring their brain signals and so on and so forth, what we see is their own brain lighting up, different pieces of their brains firing off. And we don't see anything coming in to make that so. If there's a God, it is acting identical to nature. So we can't posit God as an explanation because we already have an explanation. It's your neurons and it's your chemicals firing off. And they're doing so, why, is the question. And you have this question mark, and so you go, well, I can't explain it, therefore God. And that's an appeal to ignorance. We might not know the particular reason. Maybe it was just there's a piece of your brain that is slightly detached from a different piece of your brain. And so every now and then it will fire off and make you feel like it's God. Or maybe it's lack of chemicals in your brain that should be there but aren't. So your brain started to produce these chemicals, and that's what you think is God, and every now and then your brain will just produce these chemicals, and every time it does, you're like, ooh, God. We might never know the reason why it's going, or there might be multiple possible reasons, and maybe we could find the reason. And it will be a naturalistic reason. It won't be a supernaturalistic one, and if it is, we could never detect it. We would never know that it was a supernatural explanation. This is the problem with the idea of supernatural. Okay, so I hurt my thumb. Let's see if I can see it in the camera. Probably not. Yeah, we can't see it. Whatever. Anyways, I hurt my thumb, little tiny hole, and it's not deep enough to get into the veins. So I'm not worried about infection, but I should keep it clean anyways, and I should put a Band-Aid on it. And I've just been lazy, so I haven't done it. But I'm going to do it. Why? Because I know about bacteria, I know about viruses, and I know that they can get in there, and you know what, even though it doesn't look like they can get into the blood, I shouldn't risk it. I just shouldn't risk it. So the demons and the spirits, the evil spirits that are supposedly out there, maybe they're really the cause of my sickness. Well, they would have to be the cause of the bacteria and the viruses, wouldn't they? But we don't need that as an explanation because we know about the bacteria and viruses and we can fight them using other chemicals, simple chemicals, really. And we can prevent that from harming me with simple medicine. We've beaten the supernatural. How long before we beat the supernatural in regards to this God feeling that people can feel? Not that long. We could develop, in theory, a chemical that would block that chemical, and then people couldn't feel God at all. Now what? Now you really have nothing to go on at all for your God experience. You can't feel it anymore. Okay. So, no, don't give up your skepticism, and no, your wife isn't anything like your deity.
It's the same question, in a sense, on the inverse. And we'll start with Michael. Michael, what piece of evidence, formula, piece of reasoning, whatever, what would cause you to believe in God?
A deposit of $10 million in a Swiss bank account under my name.
That's a really hopeful answer. And
yeah, I know.
And if it comes true, I think I'm there with you. And perhaps as glib, we may get an answer from from John on, in a sense, the same question in inverse. What piece of evidence, mathematical formula, piece of reasoning would cause you to abandon your belief in God?
Historical evidence that Jesus Christ had not risen from the dead.
Can you describe the form that would take? I mean, we've already got 10 million bucks out of it.
I would want you to describe it to me because, I mean, you've suggested that's the kind of evidence that I would expect because my faith is based on evidence. It's not based on anything else. So evidence is crucial for me.
Here we have John saying that the way to prove him wrong is to prove a negative. Which is why the moderator was like, can you explain that to us? No. You're the one that came up with the question. You explain it to me. I don't know how you would do it. In other words, it's prove a negative. That's what it is. John, the burden is on you. You said that there's historical evidence of Jesus? No, there isn't. The earliest writing we have is 70 years afterwards. And I want to make a comment on that because I don't want you to get this wrong. Even if the writing was at the exact date that it supposedly happened, that doesn't mean anything, okay? But it makes it even harder to believe because it's so far out. Okay, Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, or began writing it, fairly soon after he got enough people to go along with his story. It took him time to write it because he was illiterate and he couldn't read, so he had other people, help him out with this. So the timing is a very short amount of time between the idea that this angel visited him and showed him all these golden tablets that then magically vanished back into heaven, so we can't check that they were ever there in the first place. How convenient. And the writing of the book from those supposed tablets is very close by, less than a year maybe. Might have took a little bit longer to get the whole thing finished, but nonetheless very, very close to it. And you look at, say, Scientology, from the printing of Dianetics to the eventual forming of Scientology, a few years, maybe. So the timing isn't really important. It's just the farther away it is, the more skeptical you can safely be. But even if it's right next to each other, you still have to be skeptical. You have to come to it skeptically and say, what evidence is there that an angel visited Joseph Smith? None. Just his word. He saw it. That's it. That's all we got. And even if we had writings of right then and there, that's all we would have is those people who claim that something happened. You can go today and you can interview thousands of people who will tell you in great detail about their alien abduction experience. You can go and talk to Hindus that will swear up and down that they have seen their guru levitate or heal people or even come back to life or any other amount of miracles. Eyewitness accounts don't mean diddly. And people go, oh, but that's what we use in the court system. Yes, because that's the best we can do. We don't have cameras everywhere. So we have to rely on something completely unreliable. But here's the question. Let's say we have a court case, and we have, I'll just use Trico again. Trico says, I was at the mall, and I'm the one that stole the bag. They look at the bag. My prints are not on the bag. He was wearing a glove. Okay? I don't own any gloves. They checked my entire house. Oh, well, he hid the gloves. All right? Let's see what there is. We look at the camera footage. There was a camera at this store. I'm not there at the time. The evidence, the empirical evidence, beats out the testimony. Every time. DNA evidence. We found your hair at the scene. Now I'm there. Could it be that someone got some of my hair? Maybe. But now I have to prove that that's possible. And I have to prove that it is so to defend myself adequately. And it can happen that the DNA evidence is there, but somebody framed somebody. But that's something that you could prove, in theory. We don't have a perfect criminal justice system, that's for sure. But the empirical evidence beats out eyewitness testimony every time. And what we need is a witness that is not going to have a particular thing against me, okay? So in this case, the witness is somebody that knows me. Could they be angry at me and making up lies? Yeah, so we want this testimony invalidated. That's how the team that's defending me handles that. Because they have an agenda against me. Instead, we bring in a impartial witness, leopard cat here, and this witness has no vendetta against me, is a stranger to me, and his testimony is going to be better for my side than his testimony. And it works the other way around. If this is my friend and he testifies for me, the prosecution, rather, will say, oh, well, we can't believe him because he's his friend. So they bring in an objective witness to try to use against me. Okay, so when we look at the objective witnesses around the time that Jesus existed, before, during, and after, every single one of them is completely silent. There is nothing mentioned at all. And then we get to Joseph's writings, Josephus, and we find that somebody wrote in stuff about Jesus. A forgery. In fact, 2 forgeries. You don't need to make up stuff if you have the truth. So somebody wrote in this to make their story more believable. You don't need to lie to support the truth. Somebody somewhere did lie. And every other historian before, during, and after that mention God, or mention Christ in this case, don't actually mention Christ. And we've proven this over and over again. And that the Christians still point out these people. Oh, no, it says Christ. No, actually, it doesn't actually say Christ. It says Christi or something. It's something very similar. It's a different name completely. And somebody erased the letter. Again, creating a forgery. Somebody committed an outright lie to try to make it seem more real. There isn't any historical evidence of this stuff. John Lenox essentially wants you to prove that the Gospels are false. That's not how it works. You need to prove that the Gospels are true. You can't do it. There's no way to do it. Period. None of the stories happened. They didn't happen. They didn't occur. That's a problem. There is no Nazareth. There is no census. There is no days of darkness. There is no earthquake. The absence of evidence in this case, I would say, is a good reason to be skeptical. Although it's not absence of evidence is not evidence of absence is often overused. Actually, this has been challenged in recent time, and it's a better way to put that is that when you have an absence of evidence, you should be skeptical that there is an absence there. You should be skeptical about it. We need to establish evidence. And if there isn't any, then we should be skeptical about it. So this is an idea in logic that we are changing. It's not set in stone. The classical phrase, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, is one that we are diminishing. We're not using this as much as we used to. And when I say we, I mean logicians as a whole. I mean people, philosophers. Anybody that understands how logic functions is not using this in the same way. The skeptics are saying that's not a good way to be skeptical. The thinkers of the world are recognizing that this idea needs to change. The idea is something that's worthwhile in some cases, but in other cases it's more harm than good. When you have no evidence, that's all you have. And people want to say, well, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But then you have no evidence that it does exist either. So therefore, you should be skeptical that it exists until you have some other reasons to think that it could exist. This goes with Bigfoot, this goes with aliens who have abducted people and gurus that can levitate and so on and so forth. So we need some sort of way to establish that these things happened. We need our objective witness to say, yes, there was darkness, or there was an earthquake, or the fabric did indeed tear in the temples, and we couldn't explain how that happened. We need something to corroborate these claims, and we have nothing at all. Not during, before, or after the supposed existence of Jesus. And I am skeptical that Jesus existed, and I think more people should be. The only people that seem to not be are biblical historians. Other historians, which are never mentioned when you hear, oh, but there's lots of historians that don't think this, that's not true. Nobody can provide that list of names. And a consensus doesn't really mean anything either, because what are they basing their methodology on? You know, so we need a more concrete scientific approach to how we approach history, and we need a filtering mechanism of some sort. These stories are regulated to mythology because they have mythical elements. People healing, coming back from the dead, curing diseases, etc. All of those things are mythical in nature. We've never seen anything like that ever. And people will go, oh, no, I've seen it. I met two people that say, oh, no, we saw people get healed. And I'm like, no, you didn't. You didn't see people get healed. You think that you saw people got healed, but you didn't really see people get healed. There would be no need for doctors if even one person could heal people on demand. They could go from place to place healing people. Well, maybe we'd still need doctors to keep the person alive until that person got there. I don't know. We don't have that. Charlatans of the world are very happy to support and continue to endorse religion because it enables them to make a quick buck off of the suckers of the world that believe that you can be healed by the power of a god, or sometimes by the power of crystals or whatever. What should convince Lenox that there isn't a god isn't a proving of the negative, but the absence of evidence plus the evidence against his particular god. The burden of proof has been failed by Christianity. John shouldn't be a Christian. Maybe he could be Jewish, but then again, we don't have very much to support the Old Testament either. So maybe he could be a deist, I guess. The amount of evidence for that is pretty lacking too. But it's a little bit harder to refute certain ideas of deitism. But the way it should go is the burden is on the person that makes these claims, not you have to prove me wrong. You have to find the body of Jesus. We can't do that for two reasons. One, he didn't exist. And secondly, if he did exist, how would we identify it? We don't have the DNA of Jesus. I mean, just finding a body in a cave wrapped in bandages and with a hole in his side and marks in his skull and nails through the bones here and in the wrists, it wouldn't be the palms because this would rip out if you put the nail here. You would have to put it here to hold somebody upright. By the way, the cross, not the correct crucifixion anyways. They usually did spire. Sometimes they did an X, but more likely it would have been a spire. And one of the religions that's Christian out there actually has a spire on their thing because they're like, look, it was a spire, it wasn't a cross. You got to get it right. And so at least they're trying to be historical, but they make it part of their doctrine too. If you have the cross, you now have an idol. I don't know. So, even if you found that body, and it was clearly Jewish, that wouldn't prove things to people. And no matter how much information you could get, you would never prove it to people, because they could always move the goalpost. The evidence, whatever the evidence is, should lead you to the conclusion. And sometimes it's a conclusion we don't want. I think that by and large, people don't want there to not be a God, not because of God, but because of the afterlife. Now, this isn't true with all religions, because some religions' concept of afterlife is very different than ours in the West. But I think that the desire to continue to survive is part of the reason why we come up with an afterlife in the first place. For the religions that don't have this, they rely more on the pattern seeking that the brain does to keep their idea of God alive. But no matter what religion or idea of a deity or supernatural or weird things that we encounter, we can't just give up our skepticism. Now, Michael, I included his little take on what would it take to convince him that there's a God. Well, some rich Christian could deposit that much amount of money in his name just to try to get him on God's side. You know? And I suppose it would be nice to have that much money, but it wouldn't really prove anything to me. I'd like, $10 million. That's a good amount of money to have show up, in your mailbox as a cashier's check or something, and I guess it would have to be Swiss so that you didn't get taxed on it. I don't know, but then you would need to know about the account, otherwise it would do you no good, right? So that would be nice, but I'd rather have something concrete for the world, not just for me. I want this proven globally, which means that the deity has to be willing to subject itself to testing. Oh, God won't do that. Well, then your God is nothing more than nature, as far as I can tell. If your God is unwilling to let us make sure that it's God, something wrong there, okay? That just seems like an excuse, not an explanation. So the burden is still on the theist. The burden's always been on the theist, and the theist almost always tries to shift that burden. Lenox definitely did. And Lenox believes. Oh, he believes. That's for sure. I'd rather he spent his time talking about mathematics and being passionate about that. Explain to me how complicated math works and stuff. Teach that. Go give lectures on that. Do something beneficial for society. But I guess he believes that God is beneficial for society. Here's the thing. If Lenox really believes in God, does he lock his doors? Does he worry about getting in an accident? Does he go to the doctor? I mean, when does your belief in God start to taper off and your adherence to the material world start to creep in? Almost everyone locks their doors these days. Most of us worry occasionally about getting harmed. especially if you enter an airplane or something that you're not used to. So, if there's really a deity and really an afterlife, nothing should worry or concern you at all. But the fact that it does says to me that this is a concept that exists in here, and at some point in your brain that I can't determine, it meshes with safety issues and how to maintain your presence in this world. And then you get cognitive dissonance when somebody points that out. And you'll, oh, no. I'm really, it's, a building falls and collapses on 20 people. Is that God's will? Should we save those people? What if it's God's will that they die? Well, but we should try to save them because God wants us to try to save them, and then if they die, then it's God's will? Why? Why? To see if we're good? God would already know that we would go and try to rescue those people. Or not. So, there's no need for that test. It really doesn't make sense. And not only does it not make sense, it's nothing more than an appeal to ignorance and or personal incredulity. Don't give up your skepticism. And if there is a deity, it needs to allow us to have repeatable tests on it, or provide us empirical evidence, or both. We don't have that. So all we could possibly have from the theist is a logically coherent argument. Lenox doesn't offer it. Can you? Unless and until I am presented with that argument, and or that one of you finds that argument, bring it to me, please, if you find it. Unless and until we have that logically coherent argument, we have to continue to be skeptical of the conclusions.